Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar, What is Safe? Trauma, Resilience, and What's Next? So now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Sue Shaw, our training coordinator at the St. Louis ARC. Sue has a wide and varied background that includes knowledge of trauma and resilience. So I look forward to hearing more. Thank you, Sue.
Hi, thank you for coming, everyone. As Ann said, my name is Sue Shaw, and I'm going to date myself now, started in the field working with people with disabilities at the end of 1989. I started working in an apartment complex and then moved into opening the first 2 Medicaid waiver sites in Missouri. At that point, we were told that when we moved people out of rehabilitation centers, their behavior would go away, which is kind of laughable at this point. But I was a 23-year-old house manager who didn't know what to do when there were chairs flying through the air. I was told that I could not restrain, could not use any physical redirection. And I had them trying to keep the 3 young men safe and the 8 staff that I was supervising. So moved from there into doing some staff training, also supported people who needed about 5 to 20 hours a week of support that lived in the community fairly independently. Then left staff training to do hospice with my father-in-law, moved back into work for an agency who supported 45 people with extensive behavior and medical needs as associate director for 3 years. And my daughter was a senior in high school, dealing with some anxiety and depression. I knew that it was my last year with her, so I moved out of that role, which was a very demanding role, into teaching BLS, which is advanced CPR in the hospitals, for 5.5 years. During that time, my son asked me to take in a classmate of his who had been unhoused and who was actively suicidal. Since then, I have had 8 young adults in my home, 5 of them from other countries, and 7 of them who've experienced pretty significant trauma, 2 of them very significant trauma. So that kind of gives you a quick idea of me and my background. So what is SAFE? So this is something that if you have an idea, you want to put in something in the chat, what you think it's SAFE is. Brianne or Ann, if you want to chime in as well, feel free. We can kind of say, well, generally people think it's where you feel safe, secure, comfortable. But we're going to talk a lot about the bigger picture of what is safe. So I supported 2 young men. They lived in a townhouse in an area of town they decided was no longer safe for them. They asked us to help them move. We found a house with them that was in a neighborhood that was considered safe. They were a block from a park. They had a basketball net. They were really excited. They moved into that house and decided they weren't safe. And the reason was their bedroom windows were on the first floor. They were accessible at night. And even though we could have told them you're safe, they did not feel safe because they had never before been in a place where people could actually get into their house or get into their room that easily. And they were used to neighborhoods where it wasn't safe for that to happen. And so they were not ever able to get to the point where they felt safe. We actually helped them move very quickly to another place. So we're going to play a lot with that today. That definition of what is safe, and think about safety. Most of you are probably very familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Basically, what it looks at is what are the bottom line things that somebody needs to live: water, food, clothing, a place to stay, those kind of things. And we need to have those in order for us to feel safe enough to do anything in our lives beyond just be thinking about those things. So if you wouldn't be in this webinar tonight if you didn't know where you were going to sleep, what you were going to eat, you would probably be spending all of your energy making sure those things were happening. Once those things are met, the next thing that needs to be met is safety and security. And a lot of times that is a lot harder to do than what we think about. So we're going to play a lot with that as we go through things today. I do want to make you think about, or have you think for a second about just yourself. So we want to make sure you're comfortable in this today. It's okay to get up and move around. With a webinar, I don't really know what you're doing at this point, so it's a little different than most of the settings I'm in, but it's okay if you leave and come back. It's do whatever you need to do to support yourself as we're going through this. We want to make sure you're comfortable, you're processing it. Sometimes some of this material is hard. All right, so I've added this in just because as staff, we're constantly trained on what is abuse. I'm sure you're aware of it, but I just want to go over it quickly. So if someone is experiencing physical abuse, you might see bruises, you might see, especially in the shape of like a hand or a ring or a belt buckle or something like that. You might see cuts or scrapes, broken bones, that kind of thing. If you're talking about verbal abuse, you may see someone who is cowering, who is afraid of someone or starts, moving away from people, isolating themselves, but you may also see someone who starts picking up those words, using those and actually trying it out themselves. And then with sexual abuse, you might see someone, again, who's afraid to be approached, somebody who's wearing dirty clothing, someone who doesn't want help with showering, but you may also see the opposite, promiscuous behavior, using terms they may not have known before. And the number one sign of sexual abuse is gifts or money, and you don't know where they came from. That would be happening on a fairly consistent basis. So really with the first three, what we're looking for is any sort of change in behavior. So someone, like I have said a few times, may swing to isolating themselves, not wanting to be touched, hiding, being quiet. They may also swing to being more outgoing, dressing more promiscuously, using those terms and words. So you may, but you're going to see that swing in behavior if abuse is happening. So that's a good sign of, even if you don't know how it's happening or where it's happening, that something is happening. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean abuse is happening. It could also be they have a urinary tract infection, that they've got early signs of dementia, if you're talking about an older adult. So there's a lot of different things that can be happening, but it is a sign that something's going on. In the field, we look a lot at misuse of funds or property, making sure that the people we're supporting, there's no misuse of what is that person's or what their funds are. So what's theirs is theirs, what is staff's is staff's. And there's a little more gray line with a family, clearly, but just making sure that a person feels like they have things that are theirs and that they have a right to use the things that are theirs. And then neglect would be something that maybe they're not getting medication that they need. Maybe they're not getting food, and a lot of the behavior that we see actually stems from like food insecurity, that kind of thing. So I just want to make sure we were all on the same page with this, because we're going to be talking a lot about a lot of the reactions that come from these things that happen. All right, so if somebody is in crisis, 988 is a new number that we have that you can call. Our mental health services, unfortunately, leave a lot to be desired at this point, but new systems are being put into place, new intervention teams. So calling 988 gets you more mental health help than it does law enforcement. So know that that is there, that is available if someone needs help, somebody is suicidal, they're in crisis. So when we're talking about trauma, the first thing is for people to understand what trauma is and just realize that it's something that you can react to. When I talked about being a 23-year-old staff person as a house manager with things flying through the air, I honestly can tell you that I didn't realize I was experiencing trauma. This was back in 1990. Yeah, 1990. I didn't know about trauma. I didn't realize there were any effects. What I knew was I was going into work 2 hours early because I couldn't handle going in later. I was laying on the couch most of the weekend because I just couldn't handle anything more. but I didn't recognize that as trauma until the young man that came to stay with me asked me why I was reacting to him like I had PTSD. And I realized, wow, this is something that has affected me. And I went back and did a lot of this research. And that's where a lot of this has come from. So the first step with trauma is in a trauma-informed approach. All people at all levels of an organization or a family or a system have a basic realization about trauma and understand how it can affect people. And then we just want you to realize the effects of trauma on the people in your family, the people you may support as a parent, and how you're also affected as a caregiver. All right, so what is trauma? Dr. Bessel van der Kolk wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and it basically looks at trauma and how your body reacts to trauma in your life. A lot of times when I'm talking about trauma, I will talk about the negative effects. Please understand that that doesn't mean that it's a sentence to the effects of trauma. There's a lot of things you can do. Our brain, our body is very resilient. But there are a lot of effects if there is no intervention. So according to Dr. van der Kolk, trauma is specifically an event that overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way we process and recall memories. Trauma is not the story of something that happened back then. It is the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside people. Similarly, our substance abuse mental health organizations say trauma is a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So trauma statistics: about 1 in 3 people have experienced trauma as a child or young adult. 90% of people with disabilities have experienced trauma, and that includes that somebody who has a developmental disability or IDD is 7 times more likely to experience some sort of sexual abuse as well. 59% of people in the caregiving professions of caregivers have experienced some sort of trauma as a child or young adult. That's why they're helping other people. They're stepping into those roles. And 40 to 85% of those in the helping professions experience what's called vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. That's either from maybe being hit or spit at or kicked, or may also be from hearing stories of people who are the people's stories that they're from the people they're supporting, or they're having to work 24/7, they're not getting the rest they need, that kind of thing. And then trauma, particularly in childhood, is very closely correlated with physical and mental disorders. About 80% of children who haven't had any intervention and had childhood trauma show some signs of some sort of mental illness. So developmental trauma is very complex, caused by multiple traumas experienced in childhood, chronic abuse, neglect, and other adverse childhood experiences, which we call ACEs. And childhood trauma in the context of caregiver abuse or neglect consistently demonstrates chronic and severe problems with emotion regulation, impulse control, attention and cognition, dissociation and interpersonal relationships, and self and relational schema. So a lot of different things may be affected. It kind of depends on the time that the trauma happened. It also includes the time that a child was forming in the mother's womb. A child can be traumatized at that point. Mothers aren't interchangeable. That child is bonded with that mother before birth. So if a child is adopted, they have experienced some trauma because of that. Attachment is developing between 4 to 8 years old. So it can be derailed at that point, or at least changed. So a lot of things depend on what time in that person's life that trauma occurred. All right, so the primary function of our brain in trauma is to keep us safe. And the brain, but downside is that brain keeps warning us of present danger long after the threat or traumatic experience ends. So that reaction changes the way the brain functions. We have several parts in our brain. Our brain develops from the bottom up, and So basically the natural functions, breathing and reflexes and those kind of things develop first. And then we have the center part of that brain. And one of the things that's there is the amygdala. And what's happening there is decision-making, emotional memories, regulation of different systems. And also it's kind of our alarm system. So if something's wrong, that amygdala is going to tell us there's something wrong. In trauma, that is bigger, that amygdala is hyperactive. It's an alarm system. And if you've watched, there's a few movies out there, but one is called Paper Tigers. And it talks about how, our brain was formed. If a tiger runs into the room, hopefully you're going to react, and either you're going to, run, or you're going to freeze if it's something where you would be benefited by hiding and freezing. But when that alarm is overactive, a lot of things become what they consider paper tigers. So things like tests, maybe a reaction to something that has happened in their home, or the person's home that was abusive, but now it's in the classroom and it's not the right reaction. So those kind of things can happen. We'll talk about that more as we move on. But a normally formed brain, we have a prefrontal cortex, and that is looking at abstract thinking, personality development, behavior regulation, planning, and problem solving. With trauma, that function of that prefrontal cortex is decreased. And then hippocampus looks at memory consolidation, navigation and spatial memory, and learning. And that is also shrunk. And so usually when the amygdala sets off its alarm, prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus can say, oh, but that really wasn't an emergency. But if somebody's experienced a lot of trauma, that amygdala responds, and that person's already responding before those other two pieces click in and help them moderate that response. Okay, so you probably heard of some of these traumatic stress responses. So fight or flight happened, naturally, especially when we were, chasing animals down. Fighting right now may look a little bit different, but if there's stress, it might be that person's yelling. It might be that they're not complying with what they're asked to do. Flight may look like actually leaving. It may look like shutting down internally. And then the other two you may not have heard of. Freeze, if somebody is physically able to move or get away from some sort of abuse or neglect, they may freeze. They may physically not be able to move, but it really means that they're just not processing anymore. So their brain shuts down, and that saves them the trauma. But you may hear somebody who's been sexually abused that honestly doesn't remember it for years. And then when it does come back, the brain that was recording it wasn't recording it in words and dialogue, but it was recording flashes of maybe sound and memory, maybe a few words and lights. But it's not a dialogue that makes a lot of sense. So if somebody is asking them, well, what happened, and they're not able to give a coherent dialogue, it's because there isn't one that exists. And a lot of times people will say, well, they were inconsistent. Well, it may be that they experienced that abuse several times, and what they're remembering is flashes from different occurrences. So it may not look like something that is cohesive at all. But it's the way the memory worked when they froze, because they didn't have words or story to explain it. And then fawning. Fawning is something where somebody who's experiencing abuse may try to make the person happy that's the abuser, so that person isn't abusive. So they abdicate themselves and become whoever that person wants them to be. And in doing that, they're fawning over that person, but they lose who they are. And they exist pretty much only to please that person. And so there's definite rebuilding that needs to be done after that. I'm going to jump in a little bit to ACEs here. This is adverse childhood experiences. A little bit of background on this. In 1996, 2008, I believe it was, Kaiser Permanente, which is an insurance company, came up with 10 questions that looked at how much adversity somebody had experienced in their life. They asked 17,000 of their employees these questions, and these questions were pretty basic. They're certainly not all encompassing, but it was a way for them to get an idea of how much abuse or neglect somebody had experienced. And those questions are pretty much on the tree. You can look up ACEs quiz, Adverse Childhood Experiences, again, is what it stands for, on the internet, and you can actually still take that 10-question quiz. But it looks at things like, was there mental illness? Was one of your parents incarcerated? Did anybody die? Was there a divorce? Did you experience abuse? Did you experience neglect? Was there alcoholism or drug abuse in the family? So those questions, and what they looked at they looked at then the score 1 through 10. And they basically said if somebody's experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences before the age of 21, it definitely affected their brain development, affects their development. And then if they have 6 or more adverse childhood experiences, that they, with no intervention, their life expectancy is 20 years less. So it really does have a big impact, according to that original study. And then they started looking at what does that look like for people and what do we need to do about it. I'm going to take a little time and look at some other things that we've looked at since, because there's a lot of things that they didn't take into account. I know they're putting together a new ACEs quiz. I don't know how they're doing it because they want it to be short, and it's really hard to be comprehensive and be that short. But environment is a big piece of this as well. But usually if somebody experiences an environmental emergency, like a tornado or a fire, the community rallies around them. A lot of times Red Cross will put them in a hotel. Things come back together for them, and a lot of times there may not be real long-term effects of that. On the other hand, if you have a family that's already in poverty, they may not have insurance, and it may end up in a lot of consequences. Notice that the pandemic was put under environmental emergencies. I don't know about you, but I kind of think that it hits an awful lot more areas than that. So something to think about as we're doing this is just, what does that look like? And how do we help with looking at the pandemic? So somebody might have lost several loved ones in that. They may have been isolated. They didn't have access to as many people to report issues. So a lot of other things could have happened. And then we have all of this underground piece. Discrimination, historical trauma, when you might say, but it's over. But if it changes the way the parent's brain is formed, it also is passed on to the child. And then there's also trauma that's passed on to the child. So I know someone who does a lot of speaking who says his mother was scared to death of German Shepherds. And even though he's never really interacted with them, he's scared of them. My mother was scared to death of the water, or actually my grandmother was scared to death of the water and passed that on to my mother. Know that those kind of things may be passed on. Violence, loss of social capital or mobility. If somebody is living in poverty, even though they jump through all the hoops and they get the degree, they may not have enough contacts to get the job in the field. So again, they're not able to move like they could somebody with contacts. Substandard schools, structural racism happening, poor quality of water, food scarcity, and we'll talk about more about that as we go. Just a lot of different things, substandard wages, poverty, all of that affects somebody. So this looks pretty dire, and one more slide where we do talk about a little bit, the effects of this with no intervention is somebody who has an ACEs score of 4 or more is 12 times more likely to attempt suicide, 10 times more likely to try injectable street drugs, 7 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 70% more likely to use antidepressants, and 20% more likely to become a teen parent. And then if the score is 6 or higher, with no intervention, life expectancy is 20 years less. So you also see a huge increase in immune diseases, about double the rate of COPD and cancer. Some of the reasons, one of the young men told me, well, I never thought I would smoke, but I wanted to die anyway. And that was another way to hasten it more quickly. So who is the expert? In the lives of people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences, experienced trauma, a lot of times they're very much discounted. And we need to make sure that we're listening. They're the expert in their own lives. It's harder when you have a small child, right? Because you're doing a lot of the decision making for them. But as much as you, even if they can't say it in words, as much as you can listen big picture, that's going to help. One of the young men I was supporting was 18, and he would hold on to me, physically hold on to me in public. And it took him 5 years to be able to tell me that it was because he was afraid he would be sent back somewhere he didn't want to go. But in the meantime, I knew something was wrong. He wasn't feeling safe. He wasn't feeling secure. So those kind of things, if you're able to know what those are and understand that that person's the expert on their life and that what they're doing is done for a reason, then you can start working with them to figure out what that reason is. So understand that there is no perfect victim. I talked about why a little bit earlier, and that's because that person probably can't tell you what happened to them in a cohesive dialogue, at least not to begin with. It's not, their memory is not in words. Their memory is in flashes and sights and sounds, and they're having to go back and figure out what happened and make sense of it in their brain. So that traumatic memory is not clear. One thing you do see a lot of times is anniversaries. That person may react to a certain time of year, and you're wondering what's going on. And I know that people experience seasonal affective disorder, and that's certainly more of a mental health issue, usually a depression thing. But anniversaries would be something where every year at the same time, this person is experiencing times where they really struggle. I see this a lot around birthdays, around holidays, where the abuser ruined that holiday for that person, whether their birthday wasn't celebrated or whether they were always, kicked out before a holiday, or that they weren't able to celebrate with the rest of the family, or they were told they wish they weren't there. That kind of thing. So those anniversaries may be something the person doesn't even realize that they're reacting to that. Somebody may have had a miscarriage on a holiday or on a certain day. They may not even realize that that's what they're reacting to, but you see different behavior because of that. Another thing that happens is repetition compulsion. So let's say somebody gets into a car accident, they're severely injured, their brain is trying to make sense of what happened. So they may be watching all the emergency TV shows. They may be trying to figure out what the job is of different emergency responders. They may be just wrapped up in that world, and their brain is trying to figure out what's going on. You also see the same thing with somebody who might have been sexually abused, where they may go to bars and pick people up. So things that you're wondering, why are they doing this? It's a way of their brain trying to figure out what's going on. All right, and then just making sure you're listening. And then when I say listen, I mean listen big picture, because you can't always just listen to what they're saying. You need to listen to what their eyes are saying when they feel threatened, what is going on with their reactions, what kind of things trigger them. And I'm not saying that's easy. It may take you a long time to figure out what's going on and why they're doing what they're doing. But if we can figure out what's going on underneath, we can help them a lot more. And I'm not advocating that you become a therapist at all. What I'm advocating is just listen and help them figure out how they're reacting in different situations.
There is a question that seems like a good time. In terms of response that people have based on things that are going on, for people with an IDD diagnosis, is one response more prevalent than another?
It really isn't. That's a really good question, but no, it's kind of one of those things. It sometimes depends kind of what they've experienced, and we'll talk through some of those things in the next few minutes. But no, I can't say that there is one way that somebody reacts. It's pretty much across the board. Yeah.
Hey.
And it's not always easy to figure out. It sometimes takes a long time. All right, so let's play with some words here and feel free to jump in the chat. What would you say if somebody, I told you somebody was lazy? What would be the words, or how would you describe that? Not motivated, judgmental, yeah. Sleepy, no energy, uninterested. Those are great. Yes, yes, yes. So those are things that we normally say when we say somebody is lazy. But if somebody, let's say they've experienced trauma, what might really be going on when we say that they're lazy? No brain power left for regular tasks. They're frozen, they're scared. Yeah, all of those things. They may be a perfectionist and not know how to start, because once they start, they have to do it perfectly. So it's too much to start. Have you ever heard the phrase, I have no spoons for that? Some of you may have, some of you may not have. A woman with a chronic disease where she didn't have a lot of energy was asked by a friend, what does it feel like to have the disease she had? And she normally just kind of blew it off, but that day she thought that this friend really wants to know. And so they were in a diner and she grabbed a handful of spoons and said, you have as many spoons as you want. I only get a certain amount of spoons a day. My first 2 are spent getting up, taking a shower, getting dressed. I need another one to eat breakfast. And I have 3 spoons left for the day. And I have to be really careful how I spend those spoons because that's all I've got. And so I have to really, make those decisions carefully where you don't. And I think that's something that happens too, is you've got somebody who's just getting up and getting ready is about all the energy that they have. And so making sure that we're realizing that doesn't mean every day is like that, but some days may be. So just being aware that person may be at the top of what they can handle at that point.
I think I know the answer, but I'll ask you. Does the St. Louis Arc do trauma-related workshops for the consumers also? I feel like this isn't taught in school.
We have not, and it is not taught in school. In fact, as a whole, it's not taught in Missouri yet. It's taught in the coasts. It's taught in England and the UK to a certain extent, and it's moving this way. But most of the interest, I'm hearing from people who are interested in trauma is more on our coasts. It's something that we're behind here. So teachers are getting some trauma training, but certainly not the people we're supporting. No, this really isn't being taught. It is being taught to all of the ARC staff that are participating in our MANT program, which is crisis intervention. We're looking at expanding it to a different training that would hit more of our staff. And it's not been trained to all of our management yet, but we're working on it. So yeah, it's something that's fairly new. And honestly, just being done because some of our staff have experienced trauma and have said we're missing this piece. So we are also looking at possibly putting together a trauma committee at this point to look at that more closely. So thank you for bringing that up, and it's something certainly we need to look at. All right, another word, manipulative. What might actually be going on if somebody is being called manipulative? They're trying to get control of the situation. Yes. Attempting to control the situation when they have no control. Yes, exactly. So they're just trying to get their needs met. So those needs may not be, I can tell you that somebody has their basic human needs met and that they're safe, but that doesn't mean they feel like that. So I talked about the young man who was touching me in public because he did not feel safe, even though I would have told you he was. We see a lot of this with food insecurity. For the same young man, he needed, when he lived with me, a pizza and at least a dozen eggs in the refrigerator at all times. He was actually sleeping very close to the refrigerator, so it was close enough for him. But we see some of the people we support, we move them in, and all of a sudden the bread from the kitchen's gone, and we find it in their drawer. And so people who have experienced a lot of trauma don't trust people, and they're constantly pushing boundaries. And when you're constantly pushing boundaries, you also have to understand that at any time, somebody could say, that's it, I'm done with you. And if that's the case, they have bread in their drawer and they can take it and at least they have their next meal. I had a step person who had a young woman come stay with her family, and their family had a brand new puppy. And as parents, they were being kind of sarcastic and kind of arguing about how to raise the puppy, which is, I think, a pretty normal argument. And it wasn't heated, it was just quiet. They were kind of being sarcastic, they were kind of joking, but this young woman ran out of the house, and the woman followed her and said, what's going on? And she said, when it got to this, an argument got to this point with my family, the police always ended up being called. And I didn't want to be in there when that happened. So that's a perfectly logical response in the situation, right? If you know the police are going to be called, getting yourself out of the situation is logical. But let's say she then went to, well, she went to this family and it wasn't logical in this family. Or if she was at school and two of her classmates started raising their voices and she got up and ran out of the classroom, that would be considered a behavior that maybe wasn't acceptable in school. So these behaviors become things that can get that person labeled as different or antisocial, that kind of thing. So just watching, you know, and recognizing that they're trying to figure things out, they're pushing boundaries, they're not necessarily trusting, they're trying to get their needs met. And if we, instead of saying they're manipulating me, saying what need is it they're trying to get met right now, and how can I help to meet that so that we can move on? A lot of times it'll help. And sometimes the behavior is still really hard, right? All right, codependent. Not confident in their own abilities, so they're relying on that other person. Yeah, and you know, I've got a young man staying with me right now from another country. He's been here for 2 weeks, and you know, he's a couple times said, will you come with me? And he's old enough that he can do it on his own. And he's not really codependent, he's just not comfortable yet. But you know, thinking about that, we do have to depend on each other. We can't be an island, we can't live on our own. But when it becomes unhealthy is when we're holding on to each other. And I don't know if you can see me real well, but we're holding on so tight that we don't know where we end and another person begins. And this is something that Brene Brown says. So if you've looked at any of Brene Brown's work, and especially Atlas of the Heart, she talks about being codependent and holding on to each other so tight we don't know where our borders are, we don't know where our boundaries are, and we can't set boundaries because we don't know where we end and the other person begins. So just thinking about that, I know that that happened with the first young man I supported. He was actively suicidal. And for me, I was just trying to keep us both alive. And as that happened longer and longer, it was very difficult then to separate his need from myself and my health. What if somebody comes across as disrespectful? What may be happening? All right, they're pushing people away intentionally. Yeah, they may not trust anybody. They may not want anybody there. They may be angry. Yes, you know, anger is a secondary emotion, and it's really hard to deal with angry because you don't know where the anger is coming from. So if we can take a step back and help them figure out what's really going on, there's an emotion that happens before angry. And as we get angry more and more, you don't see that other emotion. You don't even realize you're feeling it. And for somebody who has a disability who's been told to be quiet and be respectful, they may not even, you know, understand their own emotions. Again, the Atlas of the Heart, Brene Brown says we only understand a handful, and I think she describes 87 of them. So that's hard when you don't understand those things. But if you can help somebody say, oh, that was embarrassing, or that was frustrating, or I was reacting because I didn't trust someone, or whatever the bottom line is, that's going to help a lot, because then you can help them walk through how to come up with different responses or how to deal with that, rather than deal with it with anger, which is really hard to figure out how to deal with. Other reasons people might come across as disrespectful. I supported a young woman. She received about an hour of help a week from us, very independent, had a competitive job, drove to work. We helped her with budgeting. And she wasn't showing up for our appointments. So we thought She doesn't need us anymore. And we were getting ready to discharge her from the program when one of my staff accidentally figured out she couldn't tell time. So her alarm clock was set every day at the same time. She could drive to work. She could function. But when we said, hey, let's meet next Thursday at 1, she had no idea when that was. But it was too embarrassing for her to tell us that she couldn't tell what time it was. So she instead responded basically with not showing up and looking like she was disrespectful. So just realizing, the person who stands up in class and tears up a test maybe can't take the test. They don't know how, or they don't read well. And so they would rather look disrespectful than admit that up to those deficits. One thing that's interesting that has changed within the ARC is that some of our management did sit through a version of this last summer at a National Council of Executives conference in Chicago. From that, one of our programs that was discharging some of the families because they weren't filling out paperwork or completing some things is now sending staff out to sit down and talk those things through, because they realize that maybe there's something else going on rather than just that the family doesn't want the service. So active listening. I was a brand new staff person. I had been in the field. I was 22 years old. I had literally worked in the field for 3 months at this point. And I had been told to take a young man out in the community and basically to give him a reinforcer for, quote, acting like a gentleman. And acting like a gentleman was defined pretty much as keeping his clothing on. So at that point, I was doing what I was told. I didn't have much experience. And by the way, this young man ended up being my best teacher. He was 30 years old. His parents had died within 2 weeks of each other, and we had very little information on his background. So I'm taking him out into these big stores. The reinforcer I've been told to give is obviously very powerful because he's holding it together for that reinforcer. And as soon as I give it, he's spitting, he's cursing, he's yelling. So obviously, and I can tell as he's talking that he's feeling very manipulated, and I'm not sure why. And I'm, again, 3 months into this, trying to figure it out. And come to find out, as we did get some history, 1, he had experienced abuse, and 2, he had never really been in a big store before. So if you're totally overwhelmed because you're in a very large store, what's a really good way to get yourself out of it? I would say taking your clothes off is pretty effective. And so he had figured out a pretty effective way. And apparently it had worked, but then a behavior therapist had thought to give this pretty powerful reinforcer, which did keep the clothes on, but it made him feel very manipulated. And in fact, one day he was walking back up the stairs at the apartment, and he had been pretty upset with me, and he had let me know, and he said, I did it, I won, I beat the loser, meaning me. And I was kind of thinking, yeah, you did. And, so that wasn't effective, right, for anybody. Even though he was holding it together, it wasn't teaching him anything except to feel that he was manipulated. We missed something really big there, and that was that behavior was telling us that he was uncomfortable in that setting. He wasn't trying to manipulate. He wasn't trying to, I don't know. The behavior was the only way he could communicate what he needed, and we just weren't listening well enough to deal with it. So, think about what could we do instead. And obviously there's some pretty clear things we could have done that might have worked better. So we could have taken him into a smaller store. We could have started out with parks and had food delivered. Now there's Instacart. So, a lot of times I think that we put people in situations and it might take us a while to figure it out. So to that actively listening, it's really, really important. And know that at one point I had 3 young men living in a house. One of them would go to school. He would be fine at school. He would be fine on the bus on the way home. He would open the door to the house. Some days he was fine. Some days he would start throwing things, and he didn't use many words to communicate, but he knew a few choice cuss words. He would throw those out too. One day he poured milk all over the furniture, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. So we started taking notes and just looking at the behavior. What happened right before the behavior, what happened after the behavior. And we were able to figure out that if he saw his roommate's backpack, if he heard his roommate's voice, roommate didn't have to be in view. And in fact, he never interacted with roommate. And that's why it took us a long time to figure out what the issue was. He didn't want to live with that person. And that became very clear as one day he his roommate was with me when I went to pick him up. And some things happened in the car. So just listening all the time, figuring out what's going on, what is the behavior we're seeing, what's going on right before, what's going on after, and can we change something? So we move this person into a different place. So just thinking about, the big picture, I had another person moved into an apartment. He'd always lived in a house. With his mom, then with some roommates, and now all of a sudden he was in an apartment building and he was going into everybody's apartment, and I was told we need to have a behavior program for him so that he can not go into other people's apartments. And the problem was that he didn't know that that building was full of individual places where everybody lived. So he didn't need a quote behavior program. He needed to be told, this is your apartment, and this is Joe's apartment, and this is Mike's apartment. And when they close their doors, that means that they're in their house and you need to knock to let yourself in. So it was just basically an educational issue, not a behavioral issue. So I think we jump a lot of times because somebody has IDD, that maybe they need this program. Or we need to, change things when really it's just an educational issue. So listening, big picture, big piece. I put together this chain of reaction. This is something I'm still playing with. Any feedback you have on it is interesting to me because, like I said, it's fairly new for me too. But this is something that happens a lot with somebody who's experienced trauma. So their basic needs are not met. They may not be met, or they're unsafe, or they feel unsafe, whatever that looks like. So the person tries to get that need met or find a way to be safe. I had a young man who had, his mother had been verbally abusive to him when he went into the kitchen. There wasn't always sufficient food, but when there was sufficient food in the house, she was verbally abusive for up to an hour and a half if he walked into the kitchen. So he's trying to get the need of food met, but he's not safe. So others around them react to them and may escalate. Mom's being verbally abusive, or something may be happening. If others escalate, that reaction leads to feeling even less safe and a stronger effort to meet the needs of safety and security. So you'll hear kids, mom, 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 and they're pulling and jumping up and down, right? They keep escalating it. And you may not think about this, but we adults do the same thing. We just do it in a more, quote, socially acceptable way most of the time. And then continued effort to get needs met or find safety may be met with rejection if the person is unable to communicate their needs in a way that others understand. This young man decided the best solution to his problem of getting food when he couldn't get to the refrigerator was to steal soda and protein powder because they were stable, they could be kept in his room, and they provided sufficient calories for him to live when he couldn't get to the kitchen. Obviously, that's not a very good thing as far as the police are concerned, but that was his best solution in the situation. If somebody's rejected, they may encounter the law enforcement system. They may be rejected by classmates because they have, somebody told me I had a 4-year-old who put spaghetti in his pocket because there was no food at home, or mom's boyfriend wouldn't let him have food when she was working. You're rejected when you're a little kid with spaghetti stains all over your pants a lot of times. So they escalate, those behaviors escalate, they become more risky because that person's trying to get their needs met. And then over time, there are many consequences for relationships, health, and safety. So a lot of times that person is rejected. They come to find that the only thing that meets that need, they become what they call hyposensitive. So you've probably heard about hypersensitive. which is somebody is too sensitive, but a lot of these kids become hyposensitive where they need more physical input in order to react like someone else would. So they need really tight hugs. They may need to, I don't know, run around the room several times before they can listen. I would send my kids outside to run around the house a few times when they got too rowdy. And they loved doing it. It wasn't a punishment. You know, picking up heavy things and moving them, or wrestling, or, you know, some of those things that they just need that input that they're not getting because of the things that they've experienced. Don't give up. So a lot of times it takes a long time for someone's behavior to change. It's not a one-day fix. Somebody may respond in one way and, you know, you see no change. I had a young man stay with me. He had experienced extensive trauma as a very young child. He had watched a parent die in front of him. Other things had happened. He did graduate high school, but then he was put in a job that was re-traumatized him. Because of that, he lost his job. Because of that, he no longer had money for medication. He ended up living in the back room of a high school classmate. And at that point was getting no intervention at all, didn't have glasses, boots, his basic needs weren't met. And he only reached out to family for help when he started having stomach issues, and through that, sister ended up talking to me. But he, through that time, also attempted suicide, was unsuccessful, was put into a behavioral health unit where he was actually re-traumatized in there and left with a $16,000 hospital bill. So when he came to me, he was basically frozen. He didn't leave his room more than an hour a day. He hadn't held a job in 7 years. He was somebody who could have lived a life, worked a job, may have been limited, but certainly was able to function. And because of the things he had experienced, that wasn't happening. So I think our system, definitely our mental health system at this point, is something that fails. If you are helping intervene with somebody, if somebody is hiding food, or they are doing things that you're just saying, wow, I don't see any progress. From what I'm seeing, a lot of times when somebody starts receiving some sort of intervention, receiving therapy, it may take a year before they're able to hold a basic job, make some decisions, move forward with their life. And this is somebody who's, you know, of an age where they could do that. For a child, it may mean years of helping them process and problem solve and get therapy. So please don't give up. It's a long process. It's something that you may someday think something will click. I think, as I told you, this young man that stayed with me, it took 5 years for him to tell me part of the story of what happened to him. He wasn't able to do that until then. And when he was able to do that, so many things clicked. And we're actually in the process of getting justice for some of the things that happened to him. But he wasn't able to express that, so he wasn't able to get justice for it until he was able to do that. He just couldn't communicate it. So what are some of the things that hurt? Having to retell the story over and over and over to people. People disbelieving the story. Most people with disabilities are still accurate when they report things. Now, that doesn't mean everybody is. Certainly, there are some people with diagnoses of like reactive attachment disorder, that some of those kind of things. And you know that, you would have been aware of that. But a lot of times stories are disbelieved. Siblings can have different versions of what the parents were like to them. You know, so you may hear those kind of things. Sometimes we ignore historical information. And if you have been supporting someone, or you have somebody that's in supported living, sometimes that information doesn't get passed on like it should. I supported a young man who had been in a children's home for years, long enough that his reactions to moving into the home were kind of cycled out of that file. And so when we moved him into supported living, he reacted trying to hurt himself for 72 hours. And if that had been left in his file, that would have helped us a lot. But just knowing that that historical information may not be there. So as a parent, you are the person who holds that and can communicate that and may have some insight into some of the things that may be happening. Not being seen or being seen as a disability, a number, or a label. Having no access to services, services that lack accessibility for someone, services that marginalize someone, or fail to take cultural differences into account. There may be victim blaming, punitive supports, non-collaborative supports, lack of trust, or microaggressions. And then these last two I've just added, you may not have heard these terms before, but sometimes we ask people to mask. I would say especially people on the spectrum, maybe asked not to flap their hands, maybe ask not to make noises, those kind of things. And I understand in certain settings that's important, but I also know that if you've got somebody who is maybe sitting in the corner quietly, not looking at the presenter, they may be learning a lot. And if we're asking them to sit at a desk and look straight at the presenter and be quiet and not stim, they may not be doing anything but willing their whole body to do that, and they may not be learning or hearing. And then code switching is basically when somebody is having to fit into a room. Maybe they're a minority and they're changing the way that they speak, the way they dress, that kind of thing. And so again, it makes it harder to fit in, and most of their attention is going to that. And then you have some people who may be a minority on the spectrum who are trying to both mask and code switch at the same time, which is, I can't even imagine. So those are some of the things that are hard and that hurt. So as caregivers, you have probably experienced secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma. Hearing stories of trauma can cause that, being threatened or physically injured. People who are traumatized do not see many options for themselves. And then it's really hard to see options for the people you're supporting. So I kind of say that people have blinders on. If they're experiencing a lot of stress, their vision narrows and narrows and narrows. So that makes it really hard. What can help with that is talking to other parents, communicating with other people, for our staff to work in teams and talk to each other. And the same thing happens with our people who are suicidal. They don't see any other options. They may be in a situation where they don't see how they can get out of what they're dealing with. So they may see suicide as the only option, or hurting someone else, school shooters, that kind of thing. All right, so we all have a window of tolerance. Some of you have large windows of tolerance. Some of you may have small windows of tolerance. If you have a sick child this week, your window of tolerance is probably smaller. If you haven't slept for the last 2 days, your window of tolerance is smaller. So all of us have that area, and we know when we're thriving. So think about when you're doing good, that's your window of tolerance. If your body's starting to be anxious, angry, out of control, overwhelmed, it wants to fight or run away, and it's not something you choose, it's just a reaction, know that you're out of that window of tolerance. So think about, what can I do to get back into it? Now, maybe you can't leave, maybe listening to music, or what works for you, what things help you, so your basic needs are met. Think about what else puts me in that calm space. And then the other end of that is hypoarousal. So you're spacey, you're zoned out, you're numb, you're frozen, your body wants to shut down. Again, that's a sign that you're out of that window of tolerance. So what can you do to help yourself get back in that window of tolerance? Is it take a 5-minute walk? That's what I was always told, the one young man who stayed with me. Okay, you need to go walk now. And he was very perceptive. He would realize that I was starting to get out of that window of tolerance. And when I move, I process. And when I wasn't moving, I wasn't processing it, and I needed to go do it. So those are things to think about. So how does your child react when they're triggered or out of their window of tolerance? Think about that, and how can you support them? How does the public react to your child when they're out? How do you as a parent react when you are triggered by your own child's behavior? So can you effectively handle crisis when you're in crisis yourself? And I would argue, no, you cannot. But are you triggered when your child's in crisis? Certainly, most of the time. So it's taking that deep breath, and getting yourself back to a point where you're able to think rationally. And a lot of it is thinking about, what am I going to do if? How do I walk through this? How are we going to work through this issue before we, when you're at the checkout and there's candy all around, that's not a good time to try to be thinking about what you're going to do, right? It's, what am I going to do now before we go in the store so that I can handle that checkout aisle when we get there? And then how do people react to you as a parent when your child is triggered? So you're choosing your own behavior consistently. Unfortunately, that's the best you can do, is help support your child by knowing what works for them and choosing your own behavior. So what does build resilience for people who have experienced trauma? Connection to something, to a person, a place, or a purpose. MANT, which is our crisis prevention curriculum, really looks at connection to a person. That is ideal, a person, or even to God in some situations is really powerful, but people can't always connect to that. So no, that might not be possible initially. People may connect to a place where they feel safe. A purpose, the person who asked the question about revenge. This is one thing that I see some people connect to. That purpose is getting justice for what happened to them. And I know that's not always healthy, but I know it may be the only thing holding them. So be really careful if you're taking away that purpose without looking at what underlies it. For the young man I was talking about, he wasn't able for 5 years to tell me what was really going on, but he wanted revenge for basically the fact that he couldn't feel safe in his environment while the institution that had caused him issues still existed and he could be sent back there. So it looked like revenge, and what it was a need for safety in his life and a need that other people were not in the situation that he had been in. So if you can figure out what's going on underlying that revenge, is it anger that's keeping them safe from having to deal with the trauma? Is it, boy, there's so many things that it could be. And help that person maybe write out a letter to a therapist, because sending it to a friend doesn't guarantee confidentiality, but writing something out where they can talk through what revenge looks like. Sometimes we never ask what that looks like, and sometimes in asking what it looks like, we can understand what the underlying need is that may not be being met. Positive experiences, they say we need 3 to 13 positive experiences for every negative experience in our life. Some people, trauma seems to roll off their back. It just doesn't even affect them. And most of those people have somebody in their life who has been a constant advocate, cheerleader for them, has been positive, has been there, has helped walk them through. And because of, or a place or a purpose for them, has helped them so that a lot of those things can roll off. So just having that connection to someone, something, someplace, and positive things that come from there. Now, unfortunately, they say our school system is 16 negatives to 1 positive as a whole. So know that we're not there. But as much as you can put that positive in their lives, that's important. Finding an identity or a core, knowing who you are, especially for somebody who's been fawning. They may not know who they are. It may take them a while to figure out who they are, and they may try on many different identities, or be the identity of whoever is in their life after that happened for a while, but helping them to find who they want to be and talk about what they want to do. And looking at that actively may help. Letting them be heard, letting them express themselves, and also consistency. The young man I was talking about who had lived in the back room of a friend's house, asked him what held him, what kept him going. And he said, my schedule. And I mean, that's a very minimum thing to hang on to in your life, but being able to play a game with a friend every day, going to bed about the same time, getting up about the same time, taking a shower. He had a schedule that he stuck to, and that kept him grounded and kept him going. Okay, celebrating. So supported a young man who there was a lot of behavior, a lot of hyposensitivity where he needed a lot more input than most people. So he might scream. Again, it was a reaction that happened before his brain kicked in. He might hit the wall. I was seeing a lot of manipulative type behavior. I told everybody as they stayed with me that if they told me the truth, we could work through almost anything. If they lied to me, it was going to be a problem, but if they told me, we could work through it. And I knew things quicker and more thoroughly than I ever wanted to know, but we were really able to work through it. So I was seeing a lot of that. I was seeing a lot of pushing boundaries. He took a lot of risks. He did a lot of things. He was fascinated with fire. He was, just doing a lot of things at the public. He was trying to get attention for a lot of the things he had gone through, and he was being fairly inappropriate on Facebook. Those kind of things were happening. So as time went on, as we developed trust, as he was able to work through a lot of it, I saw a lot of the behavior decrease. It took a lot of time. Another thing I saw was that as he was making progress and he would gain maybe a reward, or he would get something he had really been working towards, I would see self-sabotage happen. And that happens a lot with people who have experienced trauma. They get accepted to the college that they wanted, or they learn how to make their favorite meal, or they, whatever that thing is, and then they self-sabotage. And for him, it was, he went to the store. He hadn't gone frequently by himself. He said, I took a bottle of wine, I put it under my shirt. I realized that I didn't do that anymore. That wasn't who I was, and I put it back on the shelf. Then I went to the manager of the store because I thought they might be taping me, and I told him I had done it, and he kicked me out for a year. And he was in my basement punching on a punching bag, telling me that now I'm going to start lying to you, and you're not going to be able to trust me anymore. And then I'm going to start stealing again, and then I'm going to, and it was just, he had put himself down, I'm a terrible person and I've failed. And I think that happens a lot where somebody reaches that goal and we celebrate with them, and then they sabotage themselves because they've held it together so long and they made it to that goal, and now they kind of let their guard down some. I don't know if any of you have been on a diet and you've reached your goal weight and all of a sudden you have gained 5 pounds back. It's kind of the same principle. We reach that and boom. And so looking at that and saying, but look, you're not that person. You're consistently doing better, and this is just a blip. And we need to, we're gonna go past the blip and we're gonna move on. But a lot of people are afraid to celebrate things that happen because they're afraid that that blip's gonna happen, and it will probably. But just looking at how can we celebrate? We had a young woman in one of our summer programs who would flip tables. And one of the staff came to me this year and said, she doesn't flip tables anymore. Should I take it out of her plan? No, but have we celebrated the fact she's not flipping tables this year? So think about, we missed that part. We missed celebrating. So your perspective matters, looking at things from different angles, trying to figure out what's really going on, what you may not understand, and then acknowledging that progress. So this young man that I supported had moved on from me. He was working in a restaurant. He was doing pretty well, but the manager had retired. He didn't like our politics, and she came back in and started telling him what to do and telling stories, and he was incredibly triggered. And he said, I looked down and I had a plate in my hand and I wanted to whip that plate at her head, but I didn't. I put it down and I went over to the refrigerator and I hit the refrigerator, and now there's a dent in the refrigerator. And everybody at the restaurant is mad at me because there's a dent in the refrigerator, but I didn't throw the plate. So he called me that night because he knew I would celebrate with him that he hadn't thrown the plate and that he had only put a dent in the refrigerator, even though everybody else was mad there was a dent in the refrigerator. So I think just, as much as we can work through that and celebrate and move on. And I know it's tiring and it's long and there's little progress and it's hard as a parent. But over the long haul, progress, is made.
So Do you have any ideal next steps on where to go from here, like additional trainings for the parent or the individual, therapist recommendations, resources?
Okay, so let's see, next steps on where to go from here. Okay, additional trainings. Parents, I love the book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's been very helpful. It's very hard, and long, because you can't read it all in one sitting or even close. But it's been very helpful. I know there's a lot of other books out there. Paper Tigers was helpful. It's getting a little bit dated now. Let's see, therapist recommendations. I do not have specific ones. I could certainly ask if that's something you want to email me about later. There's a few people that I could ask that I know have experienced pretty extensive trauma and have therapists they're happy with. And then let's see, PACES Connection is a really good resource. It's PACES connection.com. They are, the reason there's a P in front of the ACEs is positive and adverse childhood experiences. They have a lot of blogs. They have a lot of training that's free, webinars that are free, almost weekly free route webinars on all different topics. They have neighborhood initiatives that have come together for trauma. It's a great place to find a lot of resources.
The other question was, I thought it was a good one. Is there a way to celebrate the behavior change without mentioning it? I am afraid bringing it up will lead them to repeating that behavior they worked to get past.
Yeah, that is hard. So just saying, wow, you've done such a great job. It's nice when you can give specifics, but I understand sometimes you can't. But maybe sometimes you can generalize too without saying the specific thing. But wow, I've really enjoyed our conversations that we've been able to have that have been really productive lately. Or, instead of saying they're not interrupted by other things or whatever that looks like, that definitely may help. If you have a group that you think might need training, I can certainly, I kind of am doing some of this on the side. I'm at traumamidwest.com, one word, traumamidwest.com. And, think about what is safe as your definition changed, and hopefully there's something you can take from this.